Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, rural buses and how to improve them.
The bus service it's not a luxury, it's a lifeline. And I think some of the impacts around social exclusion, around giving young people that opportunity for work, just have far more of an acute impact in our rural communities.
First, new independent analysis of the government's plan to reimpose inheritance tax on farms worth more than £1 million suggests the measure will hit some family farms and could be better targeted. This is the latest in the long-running row about the plan, which has brought farmers out onto the streets in protest. The government maintains the tax is fair and that the majority of farms will be unaffected, as they won't reach the threshold or can plan for the change. Syntax, the Centre for the Analysis of Taxation, has used HMRC data to look at the impact of the inheritance tax change on estates, the total net worth of someone who died owning a farm. It says that between 480 and 600 farm estates a year will be affected, and of those, 43% would potentially be small family farms. Aaron Advani, one of the directors of Syntax, who's also Professor of Economics at Warwick University, worked on the report.
Obviously, a lot of the debate in this very contentious area has been around what is a small family farm. The tax data, the inheritance tax data that we use, doesn't give you any way to work out what is a family farm. Small is obviously also something that is a matter of discussion. We don't try to put a precise definition on it, but we say, a reasonable proxy could be farms that are worth less than £5 million and where they make up most of, so we say more than 60% of the value of the estate. So if you think of an estate worth less than £5 million, but actually the farm is worth 10% or 15% of the estate, we wouldn't think of that as really a family farm in the sense that it's not very much of the value of the estate.
And that leaves you with about 205 farming estates. Now, there has, as you say, been a wide variety in estimates of how many farms overall will be affected by this inheritance tax threshold change. DEFRA talked about 2,000 estates, 520 liable for more inheritance tax in the first year. The Country Land and Business Association argued that over the long term, as many as 70,000 could be affected. Where does your analysis of the situation sit?
So if you think of the 205 essentially described as small family farms, that's an annual figure. So if you wanted to multiply that by some number to count for generations, then that would obviously scale that number up. But then the question is, what do we think of as affected in the sense of one definition is clearly has to pay any more tax. That is the number that would have to pay any more tax. But a deeper concern might be, well, which are the ones that couldn't afford to pay that tax out of other non-farm, non-business related assets? And so we say, of all of the affected estates, there are about 70 a year, which wouldn't, out of their non-farm and non-business assets, be able to pay the tax. So they don't have enough other assets around cash or shares or any other property you might have that are not related to the business. And so they're the ones where potentially they're trying to pay out of income. And in many cases, they won't have necessarily enough income to comfortably pay the tax bill, even when it's smoothed out over 10 years, as you're allowed to do under the new regime.
We did ask the Treasury about this. A spokesperson told us, we designed these upcoming reforms so they address stark unfairness in the distribution of reliefs while ensuring that the few estates facing higher bills can pay them in a manageable way. This report supports that. Is that a fair reading of your report?
It's fair to say that our report finds that most estates, even among the estates you would think of as actual farmers in the sense that they represent a large share of the value of the estate, most of those estates will be okay. They will have enough other resources to pay for the inheritance tax. But we still highlight that there are some estates that won't be able to. And there's clearly a trade-off that is a social question of like, how much do you want to support those estates? One thing that we highlight also is that there's a choice of the distribution of relief. So the way in which the current regime is structured, the proposed regime is structured, there'll be £1 million of relief, and that will cover even estates that have a very small share of their estate covered by APR and PPR. There's plenty of non-farm, non-business assets around that you could use to pay the bill. You could think about adjusting the current design of the reform to be able to remove relief from some of those estates who may not need it. And that could be used to better target relief towards those estates that will struggle more to be able to pay the bill.
So what you're talking about is the government making a distinction here between people who bought land as a tax management investment, if you like, and proper farmers.
To some extent, it goes down that line. A different way to think about it is clearly if less than 60% of your estate is made up of farm and business assets, then there are enough other assets in your estate to be able to pay your inheritance tax bill without ever needing to have any risk of breaking up the farm.
Aaron Advani from Centax. This week we've talked about those cuts of meat which aren't in demand here and how to find a lucrative market for them. Sometimes the answer lies in exports, but sometimes the answer lies in finding four-legged rather than human consumers. Animals like lions and bears in zoos need to be fed a diet which mimics life in the wild, and that means raw meat and fish on a grand scale. Mary Ward-Lowry met Yorkshire Wildlife Park's head of carnivores, Bex Brown, to find out more. And just a warning, because it's early, there will be some graphic descriptions of what the animals are eating and large carnivores with dubious table manners ahead.
So in our meat chiller we have different pieces of horse hung up, so we might have legs, ribs, sometimes we'll get jaws as well, spine, and then we also defrost in that area our frozen meat that comes in for our bears, which is our beef, and that's human grade beef. So just the stuff that you will get in your premium supermarkets is what we feed here at Doncaster to our polar bears as well.
Behind the scenes of lion country at Yorkshire Wildlife Park, there are a couple of shipping containers that double as walk-in fridges. The fans are going full blast on this very hot day.
This is a menu. This is how we know what to feed each animal each day and what quantity.
This is where all the food for the park's carnivorous residents is stored and prepared.
We've got some salmon heads in there. We'd held a conference, an international bear conference, and the people that work with bears out in the wild, with Polar Bears International, there was some information gathered about the benefit of the brains of fish and the omegas. So we've introduced salmon heads to our bears' diets, and we've definitely seen an improvement in skin and fur. So yeah. And obviously, this is not required for a human. We only want the tasty bits. So this is something that we can source and sort of use to the benefit of the bears.
Some of the lions have come in from their enclosure to have a look at us. There's a pair of huge amber eyes watching me through a thick wire grill. They can smell that the meat chiller's doors are open, apparently, and they're thinking about dinner. I'm not actually sure if I've ever seen a horse's rib before, but this one is huge, and Speedy, the hyena, is crunching through it as if it was a breadstick. So the polar bears here can't eat horse meat because there's a small risk of them contracting equine herpes from an infected animal. But the big cats don't have the same problems. So although they aren't eating human grade meat, it's not fallen stock either.
So, for instance, if someone had a pet horse when it's coming to the end of its life, so horses that we would feed out, they're horses that have been shot, which I know is quite difficult for people sometimes to hear about that. But with horses, sometimes they've never even seen a gun, so they actually have no anticipation of what that will mean. We can't feed out any horses that have a lot of medication in their system because we'd put our animals at risk at barbiturate poisoning, so secondary poisoning from the drugs that would be used. Yeah.
Even if you're not a vegetarian, it's easy to be disgusted by the thought of eating unfamiliar types of meat or parts of animal. And even more than most farmers, at the wildlife park, Bex and the other zookeepers have to be sensitive to the expectations of the public.
We're very conscious of making sure we're taking everyone's sort of thoughts and feelings into consideration, but also taking into consideration our animal welfare and what's beneficial to them as a species. So, such as the horse's head. In the day we will feed out the lower jaw, and we're happy to feed that, and we don't seem to get negative feedback from feeding that. It's pretty hard for people to sort of distinguish anyway. The top of the jaw, which would have like the eyes, we usually would feed that out more towards the end of the day as the park is clearing or early morning, so we know, it's not going to be on site just as we get the school visitors. Because we are conscious, again, some children will be fine seeing that, but others might find it distressing. So we're catering for everyone as much as possible.
Bex Brown at the Yorkshire Wildlife Park. England's rural areas have seen a significant decline in bus services over the last decade, and ambitious action is needed, with greater certainty over funding if that situation is to change. Well, that's according to MPs on the Transport Committee in a report out this week. While they acknowledge that the government is trying to tackle the issues, they warn that local authorities need more support if bus services are to grow. The report suggests rural weighting to give more money to councils in the countryside where it's more expensive to run services, along with a minimum service guarantee so communities can rely on regular buses. The chair of the committee, the Labour MP Ruth Cadbury, says the current situation isn't good enough.
We do not have at this point in time any expectation in England outside London that a bus will come along sooner or later and get you to the nearest town. And I don't think that's unreasonable in a country like the UK in the 21st century.
Well, Roger Mortlock, chief executive of the countryside charity CPRE, told me there are solutions to the problems facing rural bus users.
There's just been a sort of massive drop-off and decline in service. So County Council Network earlier this year estimated that a fifth of rural buses have gone since the pandemic. We've estimated that about half of England's small towns and villages are sort of effectively transport deserts. So there's something that's not working about the model. And there needs to be much more ambition, as this report has shown. There's this huge imbalance we've got in the funding formula. So effectively, urban populations get more money per head than people do in rural services. So if you're living in a town or a city, you effectively get 58 per person to fire up the bus service, but in a rural area, it's 31 per person. So there's a real discrepancy on the funding formula. But the other thing is, I think in towns and villages, the bus service it's not a luxury, it's a lifeline. And I think some of the impacts around social exclusion, around giving young people that opportunity for work, just have far more of an acute impact in our rural communities.
The government, though, is addressing this, isn't it? There's a bill going through Parliament. Are you jumping the gun a bit here?
The government's bill does address some of the sort of long-term thing, does give local authorities, for example, the opportunity, as they've done in Manchester, to kind of take control of bus services and integrate them together. But it doesn't go far enough. I think what this report does, it talks about introducing issues like a guaranteed service level. It recognises that rural bus services are trickier to run. They've got less people on them. They're going longer distance in. So it talks about a rural weighting, that the government should introduce a rural weighting in its revised bus service improvement plan, because it doesn't have that at the moment.
We've all, though, seen empty buses trolling along rural roads, haven't we? And councillors might think, actually, with limited funds, that's not where we need to put it to run an almost empty bus.
Yeah, no, that's right. But part of the challenge is about the stop-start approach to strategy around rural buses. So, I have the joy of living outside a rural bus stop in my village. And, one of the things they've done, they've increased regularity, and slowly and surely the numbers have increased, especially of older people and younger people using that service regularly. What I also see is a bunch of people in the village being picked up in expensive cabs to go to hospital appointments. So the more regularly the more certainty you put around the delivery of that bus service, the more you're going to see numbers increase.
This report is fairly clear there needs to be more funding and more longer-term funding. It talks about 5-year plans, not 1-year plans. But both central government and local authorities will say they are really strapped for cash at the minute, so who pays?
Well, I think you have to look at this in the round. There's a business case here. The business case is that, the costs of socialisation, the costs of young people leaving the countryside, the costs of people not getting to work, the costs of people not getting to their medical appointments on time, and the costs of not cherishing a rural economy that, we heard last year is worth £19 billion. So if we want to realise the benefits of that rural economy, we need to invest in rural services. And we know that rural communities are being underserved by their investment in public transport at the moment.
Roger Mortlock from CPRE. That's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Sarah Swadling, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.